For this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and over the next half hour, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last few days. And we'll share our thoughts on how these questions and potential answers can impact what we do in international education. So we'll start with the first question, and like we do each week, we take our news stories from our themes for our news stories from our newsletter that comes out on Monday morning at 9 a.m. Eastern, called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. I'm dropping the link to the most recent edition into the chat so you can have that for your reference purposes, and I'll also share with you where you can subscribe to the newsletter. We also have added in recent weeks, we've added the opportunity to subscribe on LinkedIn. LinkedIn's one of their new features for creators, has allowed us to share our newsletter also through LinkedIn. So if you'd much rather prefer to get that on LinkedIn, please do subscribe via our LinkedIn profile. That will come in on Mondays around 9 a.m. Eastern. So our questions come from that newsletter that we see released each week, where we see themes developing in some of the news stories that we cover and providing our hot takes on. And today on Wednesdays, we go live a little bit more in depth into what those particular news stories might mean for us in our field. So our first question of the day is one that impacts a lot of us personally who have been in international admissions, international student recruitment for a number of years. And the question is, will there be a return to normal international recruiting? And I say normal because we all wish we could go back. Maybe some of us don't, but we probably wish we could go back to a time when we didn't have to worry about getting tests before we travel to certain countries or getting tested before we leave certain countries, and having vaccinations, which we know we now have to travel to most countries in the world. So we're in a position where what used to be our norm for international student recruitment, where we would go on a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks on a tour, perhaps visiting multiple countries, 6, 7, 8 countries in a 2-3 week period. That is a real impractical option moving forward. Given the restrictions that currently exist, given the restrictions that your campus might have on travel, restrictions that your campus has probably had for a number of years in terms of where you can travel, where you can't travel. And I say that in one respect because a Pi News article that I'm dropping the link to in the chat referenced booking surge as confidence in international recruitment travel returns. I don't think it's necessarily confidence. If it is confidence in international travel, it's misplaced. I think it is, frankly, what we're seeing here now is it's possible to travel again. And I know colleagues who are on the road right now. I know tour providers that had gone digital during the pandemic are now trying to get their tours back up and running and are probably having a lot of success in terms of getting interest in them because there's that need now to get back out, or the perceived need to get back out and really make an effort to kind of get back to the way it used to be. My concern is whether or not the lessons we learned during the pandemic are being forgotten so quickly. And it's just people who like to get out and travel and get back out there and meet students. And frankly, there is a lot of joy in that. Professionally, I look back to some of my best moments in the profession and getting to meet the students and the parents of the students that I've been recruiting, having those conversations with them, sharing a coffee or a tea with them, having a meal with them. Those are precious moments for me, and those are ones that frankly I'll never forget. And they really provided me an amazing foundation for why I do what I do in international education when I was on the recruitment side. And what I think has happened is you have a lot of people, and international recruiters are human too, that had a pent-up 2 years of not being able to travel and really a pent-up desire to get back out there as quickly as possible and to get back in front of students directly. And when I said earlier, I think that some of the lessons of the pandemic are being lost is one thing to a person when I talk to colleagues at different institutions, asking them about what was the impact of going all virtual in the last 2 years? How did that impact your numbers? Where were your applications coming from? And what to a person, they would say that we were getting ourselves in front of students we would never see if we were traveling. And from countries that we would never go to, we were seeing at these virtual fairs and getting them to apply. And potentially these are the ones that are going to enroll and maybe have already enrolled this past fall. And that's the piece that I think is the lesson that is going to be lost very quickly if we all just try and revert to type when it comes to international student recruitment. And we've already seen at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw FPP EduMedia decide that they're going away completely from physical in-person events, that they're going strictly virtual and online, and are doing so in part because of the efficiencies that are in place when you have virtual events versus in-person events. The environmental impact is a factor that I don't think we can really ignore. We have our individual campuses are looking at all the different ways that they can become more environmentally conscious in terms of not only how they power their campuses, with campuses investing heavily in solar facilities on their own campuses, looking at where their investments go, and that's part of the conversation now. But it's entering into the mix, and there are colleagues that I was doing. When the pandemic hit, I was originally planning to be leading a group of Davis colleges to visit UWC international schools around the world in Europe and Asia. And when we had to shift to virtual, we got institutions that joined in that were joining in specifically because they didn't want to do physical travel to those countries because they're conscious about the environmental impact of what them getting on a plane, traveling halfway around the world and going to a series of schools in multiple countries over a period of two weeks to a month, what that did to the environment. And and that's driving decision making on a number of campuses now. So will there be a return to normal? And maybe that's not as impactful in other countries, but I don't think that the environmental impact is necessarily less significant in British or Canadian or Australian universities' minds, that they may be relying more on their agent networks moving forward. There are campuses who specifically say they're conscious about why and when they need to get on a plane to go somewhere to recruit students. So it really needs to be a cost-benefit analysis that our institutions will likely be doing more of in the coming years when it comes to, is this trip worth the impact it's going to have? Is it going to generate the return that we need, but also balance that against the environmental impact that it's going to have? And you add into this just the sheer challenges you might face these days in terms of having to get tested before or after leaving, before departure or before arrival in certain countries and before departure in certain countries to get to the next country. If you're doing a multiple country tour, that can be very taxing, and you never know how that will impact flights and your ability to get on flights if you don't get the test results in time. So it's really something you want to be paying particular attention to because it adds extra layers to an already challenging environment to travel in internationally, with flights not really coming back to full schedules yet, on top of the initial challenges of visas and other entry issues that you might have in certain countries. So you really need to be circumspect in terms of how you approach recruitment from this point forward, with a whole host of other issues that you never had before. So I think from my perspective, there isn't a return to normal for international student recruitment in terms of the travel piece. I think there will be tours that go on, there will be travel that is done, but in the end, things have changed. The way we do things is changing. The way we think about where we go, why we go, and what the impact it has, positive and negative, on the planet and on who we are as individuals, that matters now. So I think the return to normal isn't happening, and the worst phrase we can ever talk about these days is we're going to have a new normal, and that new normal is going to be very different than what we were used to in terms of student recruitment. The virtual piece, I think, has to continue. In terms of opportunities, and frankly, for colleges and universities that saw the pandemic really as an opportunity to engage in online recruitment and virtual fairs and these types of things. Those colleges aren't the ones that are going to be getting on planes anytime soon because they couldn't afford it in the first place. So they saw lower cost options for paying $2,000 for a 4-hour fair that targets an entire region of the world, and being able to, in terms of generating applications and potential enrollments as a result of participation in that fair, as a much wiser investment, frankly, than paying 3-4 times that to go on a recruitment tour to cover those same countries and and the time that it would take to go to all those countries. It's just not as safe a bet as it had been previously. So I think the new normal for international recruitment is going to be vastly different. And I think the opportunity for virtual will continue. The opportunity when we do travel will certainly need to be more bang for the buck in terms of the impact that we can have. I personally, if I'm on the institutional side right now, I'm focusing on my multiplier effect I can have with counselors, with Education USA advisors, with agents, with the folks who can be on the ground for me as an institution rep that will help generate the kind of in-person attention that I want to have happen with prospective students and their parents that I can't do directly in every country I want to be in. And that in-person representation is going to be the difference maker for me in enrolling a class that I need on my campus. The travel is great, and maybe if you're in the springtime, I've heard a number of colleges say, "Hey, we'll still do virtual fairs as an interest generator, and then maybe focus our travel that we do on admitted student events in the springtime." So I think that's a more realistic and practical way of approaching travel in the future, rather than the full-on tours and 3-4 weeks gone at a time where you're traveling around the world and meeting students and parents in a variety of locations. It doesn't seem like the best investment of time and resources for me if I'm planning have a budget to recruit for my institution. I can get more coverage in more places. And hopefully with better results in terms of if I have the right comp plan and the right follow-up plan in place to respond to needs than I could if I'm in person. So that's there's nothing to beat, certainly nothing you can beat. Nothing that will beat the in-person opportunities and that personal connection, shaking that father's hand or that mother's hand of a student that you might be recruiting, and being that institution for that student, for that parent. But I really think that the time of full-on tours all the time is not the way to go if I'm on the recruitment side. And I have a number of colleagues who run their own tour businesses that will take issue with what I'm saying. But I think when you're doing focused one or two country tours, maybe you can justify that if you're smart about how you plan it and who you go with. But in terms of the world travelers, in terms of multiple countries in a 3-4 week period, I don't think those are the practical and best uses of institutional resources moving forward. So that's question number one. Now, question number two is a bit more of an intellectual exercise. And the reason I say that is the question is, are BRICS countries playing well with others? Now, for those not familiar, BRICS countries are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Those are kind of that next tier, and obviously China and India are probably the two in that that maybe are much stronger than the rest of the world, rest of the others in that mix, Brazil, Russia, and South Africa. But they, as a bloc, share a lot in common. And an old colleague I used to know well has written extensively about this in recent days and weeks on her blog. Wendy Williamson is her name, and she makes reference to how coordinated these countries are in their messaging and who they support and what they will do together that might seem out of step with what we in the West might expect, and that's something that I think you want to take into consideration when you're looking at world events. Obviously, we're dealing in a situation now with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia that the BRICS countries are certainly not shouting from the rooftops against what Putin is doing in Ukraine. They are very much whenever UN resolutions have come up regarding condemning Russia for its actions in Ukraine or removing Russia from the Human Rights Commission in the committee in the UN, you don't see Brazil, India, China, or South Africa voting against Russia or voting to condemn them. You see them abstaining, or you see them voting no. You've seen India be an outlet for buying Russian oil and gas. You've seen China very clearly not be vocal supporters of what Russia is doing in Ukraine, but you also see a lot of the rhetoric that they're using to talk about what's happening in the Ukraine, to minimize what Putin is actually doing there. There's an article that New York Times put out this past week. The link's in the chat, where it shows that China is rallying domestic sympathy for Russia because it's a reaction against the West. They're seeing China and Russia have become quite cozy in the last 5-10 years, 15 years, and they're not planning to turn their back on Russia anytime soon. You see Russia really looking for allies and not getting anybody who's really going to get on the bandwagon and really share their support for what Russia's done in Ukraine. China is trying to stay neutral, at least on the political side of things, but what they're doing is Chinese universities, and this is a quote from the Times, have organized classes to give students a correct understanding of the war, often highlighting Russia's grievances with the West. Party newspapers have run a series of commentaries blaming the United States for the conflict. So what we see is it's no longer just Russia invading Ukraine, it's Russia against the West, and that's why they've had to do this, because they're afraid of security concerns, that they don't want NATO at their borders, which they already have with the Baltic states and Poland and others. So you see Russia's reaction, and it has been one clearly feeling like Putin is feeling like he's been backed into a corner. But you also see some other challenges with how it's being perceived. Different issues like this are being perceived. Now, are all the BRICS countries against the West? I think South Africa and Brazil may be less likely to be in the authoritarian camp of Russia and India and China. Is India in the authoritarian camp? Some would say, currently under Prime Minister Modi, not been the most free and fair of elections, and in terms of his Hindu Nationalist Party has certainly caused a number of issues in terms of restrictions on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, that type of thing in India. And as I said, they're buying Russian oil. But India doesn't always play well with all of their BRICS colleagues. In fact, when it comes to international education, we're seeing that play out now. We've known and we've talked about China and how, because they've kept their borders closed longer than any other country to students, other than select elites going to NY Shanghai or Duke Kunshan and some of the British universities that have campuses in China. You see China, for the most part, saying, hey, students from South Asia, students from Africa, sorry, can't come back in yet. We don't have any plans to reopen anytime soon, and we don't really need you back here. So that has caused basically these students in these countries that had wanted to start, that had maybe begun their education in China, but forced to return home when the pandemic hit. They have been, for the last 2 years, taking their classes on their mobile devices, on their phones, and paying whatever fees that they pay to China for those classes. But China, I think, has done a lot of damage to its reputation when it comes to international education. And part of that is just the unwillingness to budge from their zero COVID policies. And you hear some of the things that are coming out of Shanghai right now, with a city of 26 million people been on lockdown for the better part of 2 weeks. That there's food shortages, running out of medical necessities, all of these things that are impacting residents' lives in Shanghai, one of the largest cities in the world, because of the zero tolerance policy. And frankly, we'll talk about it next week. It'll be in our newsletter on Monday. The State Department's actually saying don't travel to China. It's already a level 4 country, or level 1 for COVID, but it's level 4 for just arbitrary enforcement of laws and regulations related to movement. That there have been cases where U.S. citizens have entered the country and been placed in quarantine, even though they've got negative tests, not been able to avail themselves of services of the U.S. Embassy, arrested on trumped-up charges. That's increased in the last few months. And now State Department saying don't travel there. They've told their consulate staff in Shanghai that you can get out. You should leave, in fact, because it's not safe for you anymore. So there's a lot of challenges in China right now, and they've done a lot of harm to themselves and their reputation on a number of different levels with Western countries and even non-Western countries. We see now we know India and China have not been exactly best of friends of late, but the Indian University Grants Commission has also put out a statement this past week that they are warning students that those who have gone to China or have been doing their work at Chinese universities online, that those degrees would be invalid. And that's a big deal. There's been a lot of political tit for tat in recent months between India and China. They've had their border crises. They've had flare-ups over Chinese social media apps and tracking of Indian individuals, and there's been 50 Chinese apps that have been banned in India. So things aren't all rosy with between India and China, but certainly there's a lot of elements of that relationship that could drive some wedges in larger geopolitical campaigns down the road. So we'll see how that plays out. But right now, when it comes to support for Russia, they're not budging. They're not coming out and saying no or condemning Russia at all for their actions of invading a sovereign nation. No matter the pretext, you see them really in lockstep, and that's interesting to see how and if and when that continues to cloud those relationships with those other BRICS countries with the West. So more on that to be sure, and it does impact what we do in international education, no doubt about that. Now, our final question of the day: how anti-Russian should we be in international education? Now, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, a number of colleagues, particularly those in the UK, were particularly exercised by this ruthless, naked aggression against Ukraine, against its people, and against civilian populations. And there has been, with Russia's every denial, the evidence that the West sees and on its TVs and on our social media feeds every day, over the last 50 plus days now of the conflict, we see a real aggression towards Ukraine that has the true motivations of which we've seen everything from Putin's claim that they're trying to denazify the Ukraine to fears in the West, particularly in Eastern European countries, that Putin's main end goal is to recreate the Soviet Union in terms of a buffer zone in Eastern Europe for Russia. And you see attempts to put in puppet governments. That was the plan initially, apparently, to put in a puppet government if they could have taken Kyiv and gotten rid of President Zelensky. So we see a lot of negativity in the West towards Russia, and rightly so, that Putin has basically clamped down on any non-state-run media that would potentially promote a view other than a Kremlin view of what's happening in the Ukraine, that it's not a war or an invasion, it's a special military operation, and you can't say otherwise. If you do, you'll be arrested and put in jail. You saw thousands of protesters arrested in the first few weeks of the invasion. You then saw Putin have this big rally in a soccer stadium in Moscow, just to keep the Russian sheep fed with their propaganda, the Kremlin's propaganda. So, on face value, you see dissent being quickly quashed, no freedom of expression. You see universities, rectors, whether willingly or not, signing letters of support for Putin's special military operation. You've seen a number of professors from those institutions and students leave, Russian students leave if they could, to the West. Now that travel has been basically prohibited into Russia, they have to go out like they're trying to flee a hostage situation almost. So you have a lot of difficulties in terms of putting any faith in terms of what Russia is doing and trust in what they're doing. And there's real valid concerns and reasons why relationships need to be reevaluated with Russia as a country, with Russian institutions. You see the businesses that are divested from Russia and pulled out that are losing their assets probably in the process if they had physical locations in Russia. You see a number of institutions divest from any investments in Russian companies, in Russia itself. You see institutional partnerships shut down, as MIT did within the first day of the war, towards the end of February. So a lot has happened that has basically indicated and shown that the West and UK, US, Australia, Canada are anti-Russian, that we are divesting from Russia in every way possible. And when we think about what we do in international education, about opening borders, opening minds, having conversations across cultures to really share the importance of education in our lives, one of the kernels of that is people-to-people diplomacy. It is an effort to dispel false pretenses we might have or misconceptions we have about people from other nations. And what are we doing now in the West as a result of this? And there's a great article from Hans de Witt and Phil Altbeck that I'm sharing. I'll be dropping the link to in the chat. It's one of the first kind of counterpoints I've seen in international ed news that is saying, are we going too far here? In terms of our rush to disengage, as they say. They make the claim in the title of the article, in the mad rush to disengage, we join in Putin's extremism. And a part of this is a natural extension of cancel culture that runs amok in the Western world, that if you cross a certain line, your career is over. You will lose your business. You will be put to the sword on social media and ruined, in effect. And that's in effect what we've done with Russia. Those who are in the business certainly know that Putin is to blame, and he wields such absolute power in Russia that you can't cross him if you want to keep your jobs. And what we do in the West by cutting ties, divesting, whatever we might be doing, and the article makes the claim that we go too far. We're doing what Putin's doing. We're separating ourselves from cutting ties with a country, with institutions with which we've had great relationships in the past, and had maybe extensive personal relationships with faculty, staff, advisors, and whatever it might be in that country. So if you're a Russian student in the U.S. right now, or any Western power, you are keeping your head down because of what's happening. And it's a shame that it's happening this way, because they're going to be targeted if they stick their heads above the parapet too much. Certainly, we hope that doesn't get to this, but what happened with Chinese and Asian students in the United States with the pandemic first taking on, that they were the targets of Asian hate in the United States and other countries. Are we opening Russian students or Ukrainians by mistake to similar treatment in the future if we continue this? So it's not necessarily, I'm saying that there needs to be some middle ground here. I think that there probably does need to be, but it's too early, I think, for that to be in the common zeitgeist of where we are with our relationship with Russia and Russian institutions. But it's hard to maintain those relationships when those institutions that we might have had partnerships with still maintain such allegiance to Putin. And when this all blows over, if it does, I don't know. But certainly it's a new era we're entering. But it will be interesting to hear those stories about those that were forced to sign letters and toe the line. So that's all we have for you this week on the Roundup, but a lot of food for thought, a lot of deep issues in this one. Sorry for going a little bit in depth on the intellectual side, but certainly these are topics that we need to be conscious of in our day-to-day and how we operate in international education and maintain our principles, really, and in the end, and what's involved in doing that. So until we talk next week, I wish you all the very best, and